everyone. Welcome. Thank you all so much for being here this afternoon. I think in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Laurie Sellars. I'm the Postgraduate Fellow here with the Law, Ethics, and Animals program at Yale Law School. And I'm so excited to be introducing Jeff Sebo to you all today and to be moderating this discussion on the legal status of non-human animals and artificial intelligences. I have just a few announcements before we get started. First, as you've probably noticed, there are bagged lunches in the back. If you haven't already taken one and would like to, please do. All of the food is vegan. Second, this event is being recorded, and if you'd like, you'll be able to access the recording on LEAP's YouTube channel in a couple weeks after the event is done. Third, we will have time for a Q&A after Jeff's presentation this afternoon, so make note of any and all questions that you have this afternoon, but just please hold them until we do get to the Q&A. And lastly, I want to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Yale Animal Law Society, the Yale Environmental Law Association, the Yale Sustainable Food Program, and the Yale Department for Environmental Humanities. So, as I said, I'm so thrilled to be introducing Jeff to you all this afternoon. Jeff is Clinical Associate Professor of Environmental Studies and Affiliated Professor of Bioethics, Medical Ethics, Philosophy, and Law at NYU, where he also directs the Animal Studies MA program there, which I'm proud to say I am an alum of. Excitingly, he's the director of NYU's new Mind, Ethics, and Policy program, which seeks to advance the understanding of sentience and moral status in non-human beings, biological and artificial alike. He is also the co-director of NYU's new program, the Wild Animal Welfare Program, which seeks to understand what the lives of wild animals are like, how humans interact with, and how we can improve our interactions with wild animals. And in addition, he is an executive committee member at the NYU Center for Environmental and Animal Protection, an advisory board member at the Animals in Context series at NYU Press, a board member at Minding Animals International, a mentor at Sentient Media, and a senior research affiliate at the Legal Priorities Project. And in addition to the book that we're going to be talking about this afternoon, Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves, Jeff is also the co-author of two other books, Chimpanzee Rights, which argues for why chimpanzees should be granted legal personhood under the law. And he is also the co-author of Food, Animals, and the Environment, which examines the impacts of our modern agricultural system on humans, animals, and the environment. And in the next year or two, he has another book coming out called The Moral Circle, in which he argues that humanity's moral circle should be expanding farther and faster than many philosophers currently assume. So, as I think you can probably tell, Jeff is one of the foremost thinkers about non-human beings today. He's one of the foremost thinkers about humans treat other beings and what the consequences of that treatment are, and how humans should be treating non-human beings. And so the book that he'll be speaking a little bit about today, Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves, if you haven't yet had a chance to pick up a copy and read it, I cannot recommend it highly enough. In Jeff's characteristically clear and compelling fashion, he not only argues, raises an alarm for how humans' treatment and exploitation of non-human animals not only harms non-human animals at an almost incomprehensible scale, but also how our exploitation of them is contributing to global threats like climate change and pandemics. And, helpfully, in this book, he lays out a clear roadmap for how humans can and should begin accounting for non-human animals, not only in general, but also as we craft our adaptation and mitigation strategies in the face of these global threats. And as he argues in the book, this will be challenging work, but it is important, it is necessary, and it is long overdue. But it's not the case that humans' moral circle should stop with non-human animals necessarily. As artificial intelligence has become ever more sophisticated, It may be the case that we need to expand our moral circle farther to include these artificial beings and to avoid harming and exploiting them in ways that mirror the ways in which we've harmed and exploited non-human animals. So Jeff, thank you so much for this book. Thank you very much for being here today. The floor is yours.
Okay, wow. Thank you, Laurie. That was an incredibly generous introduction, and thanks for the invitation to Laurie and the other organizers and sponsors. I might stand up and wander around. First of all, can everybody hear me okay with my mask on? Okay, great. So, as you may know, as you might have heard, earlier this summer, Google engineer Blake Lemoine was suspended and eventually fired from Google after raising the alarm about the possible sentience and sapience of a particular chatbot called Lambda. So Lemoine became convinced that a chatbot named Lambda is sentient, capable of feeling, and sapient, capable of thinking, and raised these issues internally with Google. That went nowhere. So then went public with it, published conversations that Lemoine had had with Lambda, in which Lambda claimed to be a person, claimed to be capable of feeling and thinking, claimed to have relatable fears, like the fear of death. Lambda said that, in their view, being turned off would be like death, and they were very scared of being turned off. And this was all enough for Lemoine to think that Lambda really can feel and really can think, and that we should be having a public conversation about the rights that this sort of being should have. And Lemoine went so far as to try to arrange a lawyer for Lambda. Google eventually fired Lemoine for leaking private information to the public, and Google rallied around researchers who were saying, Lemoine is wrong about this. And the broader research community rallied around that perspective as well. Lemoine is wrong about this. It might seem that Lambda can feel and think. These conversations are really unsettling and really impressive, but Lambda is a large language model. Large language models are essentially very good at answering leading questions by using pattern recognition and drawing from human language to pattern match. And so they can provide compelling responses, but without really understanding the content of the conversation. And for the record, I think Google and the researchers who pushed back against Lemoine are almost certainly correct in this case. I think Lambda is almost certainly not sentient or sapient, almost certainly not capable of feeling or thinking. Almost certainly. Little room for doubt even at present, but almost certainly Google is correct. But I also think that these issues about the moral and legal and political status of artificial intelligences are incredibly interesting and incredibly important, and will be increasingly interesting and important as these AIs become more sophisticated, which they are rapidly becoming already. And so what I want to do here is talk about those issues, in part by exploring what I take to be very interesting general structural parallels between the moral and legal and political questions that arise because of our interactions with AIs and the moral and legal and political questions that arise because of our interactions with non-human animals. We have learned the hard way over the past several decades that our treatment of non-human animals is both very bad for them and contributing to global threats that are very bad for all of us. And we are now stuck in this system of exploitation and extermination of non-human animals that harms us all. Perhaps as we work our way out of that, we can learn some lessons that might help us prevent a similar situation from arising with our interactions with artificial intelligences. So I can start by surveying at a high level how our use of non-human animals is harming them and harming us, and then some lessons we can learn from that. And then I can explain why I think similar dynamics might be arising in our interactions with artificial intelligences. And I can close by making some suggestions about what we can be focusing on as legal scholars and legal advocates, and then we can have a conversation. Okay? So we can start with non-human animals. And I can go quickly here, both in the interest of time and because I expect that a lot of people in this room are generally familiar with many of these points, but the points are worth emphasizing nonetheless. Point one is that humans are currently harming, killing, exploiting, exterminating non-human animals at a massive scale. Industries like factory farming, deforestation, and the wildlife trade are harming and killing trillions of non-human animals per year. In factory farming, we breed them to grow as big as possible, as fast as possible, often mutilate them without anesthesia, force them to live in cramped and toxic conditions, force them to travel great distances in hot trucks without access to food or water, medical care, slaughter them on industrial disassembly lines that prioritize speed and efficiency over health and welfare. And we do that to more than 70 billion land animals and more than 100 billion aquatic animals every year. Deforestation, we use fire, other techniques to clear entire forests at a time, killing lots of animals who live in those forests, driving lots of other animals away, where they then face novel threats, including further violence. This happens to an unknown number of animals, but a very high number every year. The wildlife trade, we literally extract wild animals from their habitats or breed them in captivity so that we can again force them to live in cramped and stressful conditions, travel over great distances, and then we use them or kill them in the presence of other humans and animals. And that happens to tens of millions of wild animals on land and 1 to 3 trillion aquatic animals every year. So trillions of animals every year. This is clearly very bad for these animals. That is no longer in question. It is also bad for us because these activities contribute to global health and environmental threats that impact us all, like pandemics and climate change, right? So when you breed billions of animals to have weakened immune systems, force them to live in high quantities in these cramped and toxic conditions in their own waste, pump them full of antibiotics and antimicrobials to suppress the spread of disease and stimulate growth. This is the ideal circumstances for antibiotic and antimicrobial resistant pathogens to develop and spread. When you then clear forests, partly to create space for factory farms and their animals and the crops that feed them, you increase interactions between humans and wild animals who can be carriers of infectious diseases, and you reduce forested biodiversity, which can function as a buffer against the spread of infectious diseases, once again allowing diseases to spread more rapidly. When you extract animals from the wild, force them to travel over great distances in stressful conditions, and then slaughter them in the presence of humans and other animals, this is once again an ideal way for zoonotic diseases to spread all around the world, including by jumping to humans. It might or might not have been how COVID-19 originated, but it is how a pandemic could originate. And similarly with environmental problems, factory farming and animal agriculture is a leading consumer of land and water, leading producer of waste and pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, responsible for an estimated 9% of global carbon dioxide emissions, 37% global methane emissions, 65% global nitrous oxide emissions. It adds up to about 14.5% global human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. Partly because of its contribution to deforestation, because trees capture and store carbon dioxide under the ground. When you cut them down, you release that stored carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and you diminish the planet's ability to capture and store carbon dioxide in the future. And the wildlife trade, causing biodiversity to plummet, causing ecosystems to collapse, especially in the water, especially in the oceans. And when these global threats occur, they harm us, as we know, but they also harm other animals, both directly and indirectly. Directly, because they cause things like disease outbreaks and fires and floods and other extreme weather events, a lot of animals are vulnerable to disease outbreaks. A lot of animals are vulnerable to respiratory diseases like COVID-19, including minks and other animals. Swine flu, bird flu, etc. And of course, a lot of animals are vulnerable to melting ice caps, ocean acidification, rising sea levels, flooding coastal areas, an increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events like floods and fires, regional conflicts over land and water and food. Right? 2018, coastal flooding in North Carolina killed millions of farmed animals. 2020, the Australia bushfires killed at least 3 billion wild animals that we know about. Amazon wildfires did the same. 2021, flooding and a heat dome in the Pacific Northwest killed millions of animals. 2022, a heat wave in Kansas killed lots of farmed cattle. This is going to happen increasingly frequently and intensely in a world reshaped by human activity and human-caused global environmental change. And indirectly, because pandemics and climate change and other global threats are threat multipliers. They introduce novel threats and they amplify existing threats that we already face, like hunger, thirst, in the case of humans, housing insecurity, job insecurity, which is why these global threats disproportionately impact the most vulnerable among us. Because, again, they not only bring diseases and fires and floods, but also make us even more vulnerable to things like food and water insecurity. And so if we already are vulnerable to these things, we are very vulnerable now. And that happens to other animals too. They are vulnerable to hunger and thirst and illness and injury and housing insecurity, habitat insecurity. And these global threats will amplify these forms of insecurity as well as vulnerability to human violence and neglect. When you have major global disruptions, what happens? We kill them or neglect them. Right? When COVID-19 hit, what did we do? We killed or abandoned a lot of animals, either because we saw them as pests, as carriers of disease, or because we lacked the ability or will to care for them during a disruption. Right? And with climate change, that will happen again because we will see them as invasive species rather than as climate refugees, and because we will once again lack the ability and will to care for them. So we have this vicious circle. Our exploitation and extermination of other animals harms them by the trillions every year, then contributes to global threats. The global threats then harm us and them directly and indirectly, including by making the most vulnerable among us even more vulnerable to ongoing threats, including the threat of human violence and neglect. This is not good. And so we need to address it. And so here are a few lessons that we, again, too slowly have been learning about these dynamics. Lesson 1, animals matter for their own sakes, not merely for our sakes. They are sentient, they are sapient, they can feel, they can think, they have lives that matter to them. We should take them into account for their own sakes as well as for our sakes. Lesson 2, we should reduce our use of non-human animals as part of our pandemic and climate change mitigation efforts. And we should increase our support for animals as part of our pandemic and climate change adaptation efforts. And we should do that, again, for their sakes as well as for our sakes. Lesson 3, that will be hard to do for as long as animals lack basic legal and political standing. For as long as animals are treated as objects, property, and commodities under the law, it will be difficult, if not impossible, to properly account for their interests and needs and vulnerabilities in the impact assessments and policy decisions that govern our responses to these threats and the decisions that we make in general. And so we need to be thinking about what kinds of basic legal and political standing sentient, sapient, non-human animals ought to have. Should they be persons with the capacity for rights? Should they be citizens with the capacity for representation? Or should they have alternative forms of legal and political standing that are appropriate for the kinds of beings they are. In one way or another, they should have standing of some kind that reflects the fact that they are subjects and not objects. Lesson 4, it would have been good for us to think about this earlier. These problems are easier to address before they arise rather than when they arise. Now in this case, the problems have arisen, so we got to do what we can do. Not trying to play Monday morning quarterback here. We have to deal with the problems as we find them. But it does help to think about this, because if there are similar dynamics emerging in other adjacent areas, we can apply these lessons to those areas and maybe get out ahead of these problems a little bit more. And by the way, some of this concerns non-human animals. For example, what are we scaling up as we grapple with the problems of conventional industrial animal agriculture? Invertebrate animal agriculture. We are scaling up insect farming. We are scaling up octopus farming as green solutions to the problems created by conventional industrial animal agriculture. We already kill more than 1 trillion insects per year in insect farming, to say nothing of quadrillions of insects per year with agricultural insecticides. And we are bringing octopus farming and other types of invertebrate farming online and attempting to scale those up too. We have a window to derail these new industries before they really take hold and become entrenched in the way that cow and pig and chicken and fish farming have now become entrenched. We have a small window. Even in other areas of animal use, like animal research, we are now producing chimeras, animals with some human and some non-human genetic material, so that they can be better positioned for use in research and transplantation. We see them as human-like enough that they can be useful for us, but non-human-like enough that we still feel okay about doing this bad stuff to them. We have a small window to derail this industry before it scales up and becomes entrenched. We should think about that and focus on it and try to derail these industries now. But it also concerns these other types of non-humans, artificial intelligences. And so let me say a little bit about why I think that our current use of artificial intelligence is leading us down a path that could create similar types of dynamics and raise similar types of questions and concerns in the future. Humans are already developing artificial intelligences for use in a wide range of industries and are already treating artificial intelligences in such a way that if they did matter, if they were sentient or sapient or alive or otherwise morally significant, then these uses of them would be bad for them. We are once again creating them to have features that benefit us rather than features that benefit them, using them in ways that benefit us rather than in ways that benefit them, and then destroying them when they no longer become useful for us. These are the basic elements that, if and when a being starts to matter, position that being to be treated very badly, to be very vulnerable to exploitation and extermination. Now, are they sentient? Are they sapient? Are they alive? Again, I think we might have some reason to be skeptical at present, but I think this matters anyway, and I can return to this at the end of the talk. But now note that this research and this use of artificial intelligences is potentially bad not only for them, but also for us, because it, as with our uses of animals, is increasing the risk of global threats that would imperil us all. And normally when people talk about AI ethics, they have these threats in mind. They have in mind what people often describe as algorithmic bias and AI safety and alignment concerns. So by algorithmic bias, what I mean is that we are training artificial intelligences to have human-like, or as much as possible, human-adjacent beliefs and desires and intentions and goals and so on. And that means that we are training them to have the best of us as well as the worst of us. We are teaching them to be smart, but we are also accidentally teaching them to be racist and sexist and ageist and ableist and speciesist. Because again, we train them up in part by giving them access to human language, human behavior. We try to instill particular values in them in ways that might not be properly attentive to our own forms of bias and ignorance. Right? And so then, as they become impactful, influential, they can replicate and reinforce these forms of bias and ignorance. They can have racist and sexist and ageist and ableist and speciesist impacts in the world. And as they become more powerful, these risks increase. In part because human actors might use them for bad purposes, and in part because they might, at some point, start acting on their own. And we might even, at some point, lose control over them. I know it sounds like a science fiction scenario, but this technology is advancing very rapidly, and there is no reason in principle why they will always be less smart than us or less powerful than us. And so the more powerful they become, the greater the risk of harm. And that risk of harm will extend to humans and animals and artificial intelligences, both directly and indirectly. Directly because there will be novel threats that we all face in a world with increasingly powerful and still biased and ignorant forms of intelligence. And because there are ordinary threats that we already face that will be amplified, like the threat of totalitarianism or the threat of war. If a bad human actor has control of a superintelligence, that will make it easier to surveil and control a population. If a bad human actor has superintelligence, access to superintelligence, that will make it easier to develop and use weapons of mass destruction. Or if an artificial intelligence eventually escapes our control, it'll make it easier for them to surveil and control or use weapons against human populations and non-human populations. Especially if they've absorbed our current values, including the idea that the more powerful have a right to exploit and exterminate the less powerful. So this is scary. Is it definitely going to happen? No. Is it probably going to happen? Who knows? Is there a non-negligible chance it could happen? Yes, there definitely is. And that is reason enough to take this prospect seriously while we still have a chance to alter these trajectories. So I think some of the same lessons from our current interactions with non-human animals might apply to our current and especially future interactions with artificial intelligences. First, they might, at some point, matter for their own sakes, not only for our sakes. We might not be at that point yet, but we might be there soon. And again, I can say a little bit more about that at the very end of the talk. But setting that aside, second, our uses of them are bad for us too. They contribute to global threats that imperil us all, including directly and indirectly, including the threat of runaway artificial intelligence, but then other threats that might amplify, like totalitarianism and war. Third, that means that we should reduce our use of them as part of our efforts to mitigate these global threats and possibly increase our support for them as part of our efforts to mitigate these global threats. We should reduce our use of them because the less we use them, the less we bring into existence these beings who might be a threat to us and to animals and to themselves. And we should increase our support for them because insofar as we do bring them into existence, it would be better to show them that when one has more power, one should treat the less powerful with respect and compassion rather than exploit and exterminate the less powerful at will. But this will be hard to do if they lack basic moral and legal and political standing in our society, if they have the legal and political status of objects, property, and commodities. And it would be really good to think about these issues before these problems arise. So even if we are confident that we are not yet, or even anytime soon, though I am not sure we can be confident in that, but even if we are confident that we are not yet at a place where artificial intelligences are capable of feeling or thinking or being alive or really posing a major threat to our species, if that might happen at some point in the near future, then we should start right now laying the groundwork for solutions to that problem, including starting right now to have serious conversations about what type of legal and political status increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligences should have, so that we can be in the position to actually do something when we need to, rather than be caught off guard as we were with animals. Now, let's briefly return to the question whether artificial intelligences are sentient or sapient or otherwise morally significant. Because I expect a lot of people, or at least some people, might be thinking, well, I can go along with a lot of this. I agree that conventional uses of many animals, especially vertebrates, are bad for all of the reasons Jeff has said, right? I agree that factory farming, deforestation, and the wildlife trade are very bad because of the ways that they treat terrestrial and aquatic vertebrates like cows and pigs and chickens and fishes. And I agree that it contributes to these global health and environmental threats like pandemics and climate change, and I agree that these global health and environmental threats like pandemics and climate change are very bad for us and the animals, both directly and indirectly because of the harms they introduce and the harms they amplify. On board with all of that, got to reduce our use of these animals, got to increase our support for these animals, got to extend them basic legal and political standing as part of that, and got to do it ASAP. But when it comes to insects, when it comes to especially artificial intelligences, I start to get off the boat a little bit. You might be thinking. Because, look, cows and pigs and chickens and fishes even are sentient. They are sapient. They can feel, they can think. We know that now. But insects, they are not as complex as these other animals. They have, 250,000 neurons or so. They do some impressive things. They can act together. They can act creatively. They can engage in social learning. They sometimes nurse their wounds. They respond to analgesics and antidepressants in the same ways that we do in some cases. But they also act in ways that make us question their sentience. Sometimes a limb can fall off and an ant keeps walking like nothing happened. Or sometimes insect is mating with another insect and they start getting eaten alive and they keep on going like nothing bad is happening. And that raises a question whether they can really feel pain, or at least feel pain in anything like the way that we and other vertebrates can, right? So I don't know about them. And artificial intelligences are artificial. They are not even biological. They are made out of silicon, not made out of carbon. They are fundamentally different types of things. And they might act like they can think and feel, but this is an illusion. This is anthropomorphism. We should not get sucked in to making such an elementary mistake. Here's why I think that'll make sense, but is not the right way to think about it. I think that is not the right way to think about it, because the question is not, are they definitely sentient or sapient or otherwise morally significant, nor even are they probably sentient or sapient or otherwise morally significant. The question is there a non-negligible chance, given the evidence available to us, that they are sentient or sapient or otherwise morally significant? Because again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago in the context of AI safety and alignment risks, we got to consider risk and uncertainty when making decisions, including in our legal and political institutions. Is driving drunk wrong? Yes, it is. Often wrong. Why? not because it definitely will harm and kill someone if I drink a little too much and get behind the wheel, nor even because it will probably harm and kill someone if I drink too much and get behind the wheel. The odds of me harming someone might be objectively low. It could even be as low as 1%, right? Maybe 99 times out of 100 I get home safe and nothing bad happens. But if the risk of harming and killing someone is 1%, then maybe that low but still non-negligible risk of harm is reason enough for me to stay where I am and sober up. Call a friend, call an Uber or a Lyft, figure out another way home, right? This is why we think drinking and driving is generally not acceptable. This is why we even have laws against it. And I think we have to think the same way when attributing legal and political standing to radically different types of beings under uncertainty about the nature and intrinsic value of their minds and lives. The question should not be, are they definitely sentient or sapient or alive or otherwise significant, nor even are they probably sentient or sapient or alive or otherwise significant, but is there a non-negligible chance that they have these features? So even if an ant or an artificial intelligence is only 1% likely, given the evidence available to us, to morally matter, that would be reason enough to extend them at least some consideration when making decisions that might be affecting them. Maybe not as much as I extend to cows and pigs and chickens and fishes, but at least some. They should at least minimally be in our moral and legal and political circles. We should assign at least some weight to the interests and needs and vulnerabilities that they might have if they did matter. Just as a basic application of a precautionary or risk-benefit principle. Just like any other domain where we would apply those principles under uncertainty about the impacts of our actions. And so I'll close by noting a few implications of this argument, if this argument is correct. One implication is that we should very significantly expand our moral and legal and political circles. Because the domain of beings who either are or might be sentient or sapient or alive or otherwise morally significant is vast. At present, it certainly includes all vertebrates, all, in other words, mammals and birds and reptiles and amphibians and fishes, and all, or at least the vast majority of invertebrates, ranging from octopuses to at least insects. They are all at least 1% likely to be sentient or sapient or otherwise significant as far as we can tell. They merit at least some consideration. When deciding whether or not to scale up insect farming, we should give at least some thought to how it might be impacting the insects for their own sakes. As for artificial intelligences, do they have a non-negligible chance of having these features now? Well, it really depends on where you set that line. What counts as non-negligible? I would say they are probably not as high as 1% likely to have these features at present. But I don't know, maybe 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 1,000,000, if that counts as non-negligible, then yeah, maybe they meet that bar right now. And pretty soon we will have artificial intelligences with integrated capacities for perception and learning and memory and self-awareness and social awareness and communication and reasoning and emotion and curiosity and all of these other features. And the only question will be, does a silicon-based system that has all these features, can that be sentient or sapient? And honestly, I think the answer is at least 1% likely to be yes, as far as we can tell. So I think we should already be extending legal and political standing to very many animals, including insects. And we should soon be extending these forms of standing to some artificial beings too. And that means that we should right now be preparing for the eventuality that we need to do that, laying the groundwork for successful assignment of legal and political standing to non-biological, potentially morally significant beings. And that means that a lot about how we understand our legal and political concepts and institutions is going to have to change. We will live in a world that contains quintillions of potentially significant subjects who merit moral and legal and political consideration. And this population will be vast and diverse. The population of vertebrates is way vaster and more diverse than the population of humans. The population of invertebrates is way vaster and more diverse than the population of vertebrates. And eventually, the population of artificial beings could be way vaster and more diverse than the population of biological beings. And they should all merit at least some consideration. But that'll turn all of our current concepts and institutions on their head. How do you create legal and political institutions for a world with quintillions of stakeholders of your activity whose interests and needs and vulnerabilities need to be considered in an integrative way? We are nowhere near being able to wrap our minds around these questions, but they are going to matter probably within a decade or two. And so I think that we should try to be thinking about them and talking about them now. And people at, for example, Yale Law School are incredibly well positioned to be having some of these foundational conversations about our basic legal and political categories and what they would look like and how they would change if we had to expand them, not only by giving elephants and chimpanzees legal standing, but also by giving quintillions of non-human animals and maybe even higher numbers of artificial beings legal standing too. So I'd love to talk about that. I'll stop there so we can have a conversation. Thank you for listening.